A town that paid its taxes to a county with no record of it. A family printed on a census that burned twice under the same hand. A bridge over the bend that 3 generations of men swore they would never cross once the light had gone out of the sky. The people of Bleak Ash Bend carried these things the way a man carries a stone in his boot, quietly, and for far longer than anyone should have had to. For almost 90 years the village held to one arrangement above all the others, an arrangement the men made among themselves and the women pretended they had never heard about. They fed the Selkirks, they lied for the Selkirks. And when a stranger finally arrived, asking why the family down at the water never seemed to age the way the rest of the parish aged, the whole town fell silent in the same breath, the way a wide field goes still in the minute before weather turns against you. I went to Bleak Ash Bend to write about a flood. I came back with something the county archivist begged me on the phone not to print. Before we go a single step further, do one small thing for me. Down in the comments type the word Bend. If you have ever lived in a place that keeps a secret the whole town has quietly agreed never to say out loud. I read every one of those comments myself, and by the time we reach the end of this, you will understand why that one word matters far more than it seems like it should right now. And if the reason you found this channel is that you already suspect the official record was built to bury something much older than the official record admits, then subscribe before you forget, because this channel exists for a single purpose, to open the ledgers that somebody worked very hard to keep shut. The bend does not appear on the state highway map. You will not find it on the county tourism page, and if you telephone the Regional Historical Society and ask for it by name, the volunteer who answers will go quiet for a beat too long before telling you they have nothing filed under that heading. I have made that call. I have heard that pause. It is the same pause I would come to hear from nearly everyone who had ever stood on that ground, a pause that is not forgetfulness, but its exact opposite, the careful hesitation of a person deciding how much they are still allowed to remember. What carried me out there in the first place was one line inside a water survey from the 1890s. A single sentence a state engineer had written in the margin of a report about a river that kept refusing to behave. He was measuring the depth of a channel that the map said should have been shallow, and the channel was not shallow. Below the silt, his sounding line kept striking something flat and regular and long, something that ran for hundreds of feet under the mud in a straight edge that no river builds on its own. He wrote that the obstruction appeared to be worked stone. He wrote that it followed the old town line, and then, in a hand that grew smaller and tighter toward the end of the page, he wrote that the residents of the bend had asked him to stop taking measurements and to leave before nightfall, and that he had chosen, for reasons he did not care to record, to do exactly as they asked. That was the sentence that would not let me sleep. A grown man, a trained engineer with a state commission and a paycheck, packing his instruments in the middle of a survey because a handful of farmers standing at the tree line had asked him quietly to go. Men like that do not spook. Men like that measure things for a living, and they finish what they start. Whatever those farmers said to him at the water, it was enough to make a professional abandon a paying job and never file a follow-up. When I pulled his later reports, every one of them covered a different county. He never went back to the bend. He never wrote its name again. So I drove out to find a river that hid worked stone under its mud, and instead I found a town that hid a family, and the family in the end hid something older than the town, older than the county, older than the flood that everyone there used as a polite way of not talking about the thing underneath. The flood is what they tell outsiders. The flood is the cover story a whole village learned to give with a straight face. The Selkirks are what the flood was invented to cover. I need you to understand the geography before you can understand the fear, because in Bleak Ash Bend the two were never really separate. The village sits inside a long curve of dark water, where the river doubles back on itself, and the land inside that curve is lower than the land around it, low enough that from the church steps you look down into the town rather than across at it. Locals never called it a valley, they called it the bowl. The old people, when they were being honest, which was almost never, called it the mouth. The parish clerk who let me into the records room was named Hollis Verrick, and he was the fourth Verrick to hold that office in an unbroken line. His grandfather's grandfather had kept the same ledgers in the same hand in the same locked cabinet, and Hollis spoke about those books the way other men speak about a relative they love and are also a little afraid of. He told me on the first afternoon that the parish register of Bleak Ash Bend was the most complete rural record in the region, that it went back further than the county itself, and that it had survived 2 courthouse fires and a flood without losing a single page. He said all of this with pride. Then he set the oldest volume on the table between us, opened it to a page near the middle, and I saw that he had lied without knowing he was lying. The book had been burned, not the whole book, one section deep in the interior where the binding held pages that had clearly been scorched along their edges, and then, impossibly, returned to the volume and sewn back in. The paper there was browner, brittler, the ink browner still. Somebody had taken a specific span of years out of the register, put fire to it, and then carefully preserved the burned remains rather than replacing them with clean copies. When I asked Hollis why a man would burn a record and then keep the ashes, he looked at the page for a long moment and told me a thing his father had told him, which was that in the Bend you never destroy a name completely, because a name you destroy completely comes looking for the hand that destroyed it. I did not laugh. By then I already knew better than to laugh at anything in that town. The burned section covered the census years, the counts the parish took every decade to send up to the county. And here is where the ground first shifted under me. The county has no census for Bleak Ash Bend before the 1920s. None. The state has none. As far as the official record of this country is concerned, the town did not begin to exist as a countable place until the decade after the First World War. But the parish register in front of me held counts going back more than a century before that, decade after decade, in the same steady clerk's hand, and every single one of those earlier counts had been burned and sewn back in. Somebody at the county had struck the town from the record. Somebody at the parish had refused to let the record die. And between those two decisions, in that scorched and stubborn gap, the same handful of names appeared in every count, generation after generation, without the additions and subtractions that a real family throws off across 100 years. The Selkirks were in every burned census. Corliss Selkirk, head of household, the same first name, the same spelling, the same position at the top of the list in 1811 and 1841 and 1871 and 1901. A normal family register is a river. People are born into it, marry out of it, die out of it, and the surnames braid together as the decades pass. The Selkirk entries did none of that. Corliss stayed Corliss, the household stayed the same size, and where every other family in the book eventually thinned out or married away or simply ended, the Selkirks held their exact shape across 90 years of counts, as if the same people had been recorded again and again, decade after decade, by clerks who knew they were writing down the impossible and wrote it down anyway. Hollis would not meet my eyes when I laid the counts side by side on the table. He told me his grandfather had shown him the same thing when he was 19, and had made him swear the same oath every clerk before him had sworn, which was to keep the record whole, to keep it hidden, and to never, under any circumstances, help an outsider carry a Selkirk name out of the bowl. By opening the cabinet for me, he had broken that oath. He knew it. I watched him decide to keep breaking it, and I watched what the decision cost him in his face. Before we move on to the second ledger, stop for a second. What you just heard about the census that burned twice is the part that changes everything, but it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original parish record. The double burning, the names that stayed, it is all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The Selkirk house stood where the river bent hardest, on a spit of black ground that flooded most springs and never once washed the house away. Every other structure that close to the water had gone under at least once in living memory. Barns had floated off their foundations. A mill had been carried 2 miles downstream in a single night. The Selkirk house sat lower than any of them, closer to the channel than any of them, and the water simply went around it every year, the way the state engineer's sounding line had gone around the work stone underneath. People in the Bend did not think this was luck. People in the Bend thought the house sat on something that told the river where it was allowed to go. I saw the house on my 3rd day. Hollis would not take me, so I walked the old towpath alone in the early afternoon, when the light was as strong as it was going to get, because more than one person had warned me without quite saying why that I should not be near the water there after dark. From a distance the house looked ordinary in the way old houses do, a low dark building with a steep roof and small deep windows. It was only when I came closer that the details began arranging themselves into wrongness. The house was too long for the number of windows on it. The stone of the foundation did not match the stone of the walls, and it did not match anything else in the county either. It was a grey, close-grained stone laid in courses so tight and so even that the seams had almost vanished, the kind of masonry you find under cathedrals and under nothing else, and the walls of rough local fieldstone sat on top of it, like a shack built on a temple. The foundation was older than the house. Anyone could see it. The foundation was older than the town. A man was standing in the doorway when I looked up from the stonework. I had not heard the door, I had not seen him come out. He was simply there, filling the frame, and he was watching me with the flat patience of a person who has watched a great many strangers walk up that towpath and has never once been surprised by any of them. He was tall enough to sit wrong against the low doorway, and he held himself with his head slightly bowed, not out of weakness, but out of long habit, the stoop of a man used to ceilings built for smaller people. His face was hard to hold in the eye. I have tried many times since to describe it, and I cannot, not because I have forgotten it, but because there was something in the proportions of it that the memory keeps trying to correct, smoothing him into an ordinary man, because an ordinary man is what the mind would prefer to have seen. He did not tell me his name. He did not need to. I had read it 4 times in a burned book. When I said good afternoon, he inclined his head a fraction and said, in a voice lower and slower than any voice I have heard before or since, that I had come a long way to look at old stone. I told him I was writing about the flood. He smiled at that, or his face did something in the region where a smile lives, and he said that the flood was a good story, that the flood had kept the bend safe for a very long time, and that I should be careful, walking back, not to lose the light. Then he stepped back into the dark of the house, and the door was shut, and again I had not heard it move. I stood on that black spit of ground with my heart going too fast, and I understood all at once, and with a certainty I could not argue myself out of, 3 things. The man in the doorway was Corliss Selkirk. The name in the 1811 census was not an ancestor of his, and every man in Bleak Ash Bend who had ever carried food down that towpath had known both of those things, and had carried the food anyway, and had gone home and had said nothing to their wives for 90 years. The arrangement, once I understood that it existed, was everywhere in the town, hidden the way a word is hidden inside a language you have not learned to read. It was in the schedule the men kept without ever writing it down. You saw it in the second larder that nearly every farmhouse in the Bend maintained, a smaller cold store separate from the family's own, always fuller than it needed to be, always missing things by the end of the week that no one in the household had eaten. It was in the way the general store ordered 1/3 more flour, salt and tallow than the population of the bowl could account for, and in the way the storekeeper wrote those extra orders under a column he labelled simply upkeep. Upkeep of what? I asked him. He was an old man with clean hands and a careful mouth, and he told me it was upkeep of the arrangement, and that a man who had lived his whole life in the Bend did not ask what the arrangement was. He only kept his part of it, because keeping your part was the rent you paid to live inside the curve of that water and sleep soundly. I pieced the shape of it together over 2 weeks, from men who would tell me a corner of it and then stop, frightened, when they realized how much of the corner they had given away. Every household with a grown man in it took a turn. The turns rotated on a cycle that the older men carried in their heads, a cycle older than any of them, so that no single family ever carried the burden 2 seasons running, and no single family was ever fully free of it. When your turn came, you filled a covered basket from the second larder, and you carried it down the towpath in the last of the daylight, and you left it on the flat grey stone at the head of the spit, and you walked back without looking behind you, and you were home before full dark. That was the whole of a man's duty. Bring the basket, leave it on the stone, do not look back, be home before dark. 90 years of men had done exactly that, fathers teaching sons, and not one of them, as far as I could ever learn, had ever spoken the reason out loud, not to their sons, not to their wives, not to a priest, not to me. The women knew. Of course, the women knew. You cannot empty a larder every week for 90 years and have the women of a town not know. But the knowing was kept in a separate room of the mind, sealed off, never opened in speech, and this too was part of the arrangement. The men carried the baskets, and the women pretended the baskets did not exist, and in the space between those 2 silences, the town went on breathing. A schoolteacher I will come to shortly had told me the truest thing anyone said to me in the Bend. She said that in every marriage in that town there was a third person who was never named, and that the third person ate first. I asked the obvious question everywhere I went, and I never once got a straight answer to it. What happens if a man does not bring the basket? What happens if the arrangement stops? Nearly all of them simply would not answer. They would look at the water, or at their hands, or at the door, and change the subject with a firmness that closed the matter. But an old widower named Emmett Shaw, who had been the closest thing the Bend ever had to a doctor, answered me one evening after I had brought him enough whisky to loosen a truth he had kept for 60 years. He said that it had stopped once. He said it was during the hard winter of 1919, when the influenza came through the bowl and killed a third of the men in 3 weeks, and there were not enough hands left standing to keep the cycle turning, and for 11 days no basket went down the towpath. And then he stopped talking, and he would not start again, and the only thing I could get from him after that was the number. Not how many, he said, when I pressed him, just how many houses stood empty by spring. 9. 9 houses, he said, and closed the ledger of his mouth for the night. Here is where the story stops being a ghost story and starts being a history, because the foundation of the Selkirk house was not the only worked stone in the bowl. It was only the piece that still stood in the open air. Once I knew to look for the grey, close-grained masonry, I found it surfacing all over the low ground like the top of a skull pushing up through a shallow grave. There was a course of it in the churchyard wall, plainly reused, plainly older than the church. There was a run of it lining the deepest part of the old mill race, laid with a precision no mill builder ever bothered with. And there was, at the very centre of the bowl, in a fallow field that no farmer in the Bend would plough, a low ring of it barely showing above the grass, an arc that curved and then broke and then curved again. And when I paced it out and drew it in my notebook, the shape that came together was not a foundation and not a wall. It was a point, one point of a great star, buried with the field lying in the socket where the rest of the star should have been. I have seen those shapes before. Anyone who has looked into the strange geometry of the old towns has seen them. Across the whole northern half of the world there are the outlines of star-shaped works sunk into the earth beneath ordinary cities. Walls lay out in perfect radiant symmetry, too large and too precise and too numerous to be the forts that our histories politely insist they were. They sit under capitals and under cornfields alike. They are older than the record admits, and they are always half buried, as though the ground itself rose up around them in a single event and swallowed the lower world whole. The people who study the great mud, the sudden layer of sediment that lies over the old world everywhere you dig for it, have a plain word for what happened. They call it the reset, a world that was, buried in an afternoon, and a thinner, poorer, more forgetful world built on top of the drowned one, out of its bones by people who no longer quite remembered what the bones had been for. Bleak Ash Bend sits in the socket of a buried star, in a bowl of low ground that the great mud filled to the brim, on top of a drowned town whose grey stone still tells the river where to go. The state engineer sounding line found the top of it under the channel. The Selkirk house sits on the one point of that star that never went fully under, and the family that lives on that point does not age, is counted in every burned census under the same name, and has been fed by the men of the village above them for as long as the village has existed. You do not need me to say the next sentence out loud. You have already heard yourself think it. But I am going to say it anyway, because it is the thing the whole town spent 90 years not saying, and somebody has to. The Selkirks are not the old family of Bleak Ash Bend. The Selkirks are what was living in Bleak Ash Bend before the mud came, and they did not drown with the rest of it, and the town that grew up afterward on the ceiling of the drowned world has been keeping them fed ever since, the way you keep something fed that was here before you and will be here after you and cannot, by any means anyone has ever discovered, be made to leave. Corliss Selkirk was not counted 4 times because 4 men shared a name. Corliss Selkirk was counted 4 times because the clerk who came every decade to write down the living kept finding the same person alive in the same house, and did not know what else to do but write the name down again, and then, being a wise man, put fire to the page. The schoolteacher was named Ardith Crane, and she had taught in the one-room school on the high ground above the bowl for 31 years before she retired. She was the only person in the bend who agreed to talk to me plainly, without the pauses, without looking at the water, and I have thought many times since about why that was, and I believe it was because she had spent her life among the town's children and had watched what the arrangement did to them, and she had decided somewhere along the way that the silence was a sin she no longer wished to die inside of. There were Selkirk children. That was the first thing she told me, and it landed like a hand on the back of my neck. Across the years there had been Selkirk children in her school, sometimes one, sometimes two, appearing on the roll without a birth ever having been recorded, staying for a season or two, and then simply not coming back. They were quiet, they were clever, and the cleverness unsettled the other children and unsettled her more. Their sums came out right without anyone teaching them. They read words they had never been shown, and they were cold to the touch, she said, not sickly cold, but cool and even, like river stones that have never seen the sun. And when she took a small Selkirk hand in hers to guide a pencil, the coolness of it did not warm the way a living child's hand warms in yours. It stayed exactly as cool as the water they had come from. She kept one drawing. She showed it to me at her kitchen table with hands that were not entirely steady. A Selkirk boy had made it, she thought, around the year she began teaching, more than 3 decades before we spoke. The other children that year had been asked to draw their houses, and they had drawn the ordinary houses of the bend, square things with a door and 2 windows and a curl of smoke. The Selkirk boy had drawn his house too, but the house he drew was not the low dark building on the spit. He had drawn a tall thing, taller than any building in the county, a tower of the grey stone standing in open sunlight with a great arched door and windows in high rows going up and up. And around the base of it he had drawn people, ordinary-sized people, and they were small against it. And they were bowing, and the whole town rose out of the drawing hole and dry and lit, a town that had never known mud, a town from before. In a careful child's hand he had titled it. He had called it home. And when Ardith Crane had asked him gently where this house was, the boy had looked at her with the flat patience of his father in the doorway and told her that it was still here, that it was only downstairs. She never asked him another question. He stopped coming to school not long after, the way they all did, and she filed the drawing away and did not look at it for 30 years. And when she finally took it out again to show me, she wept, quietly, not for the boy, but for every child she had taught who had walked home down the high road, knowing there was a third person in their parents' marriage who ate first, and who had never once been allowed to ask its name. She said the cruelty of the arrangement was not that the town fed the thing in the bowl. She said the cruelty was that the town taught its children to feed it too, before they were old enough to refuse, so that by the time they were grown the feeding was simply weather, simply something that happened, simply the shape of the world, and there was no longer any self left in them that could stand outside it and call it wrong. I asked her the question I had asked everyone, what happens if it stops? And Ardith Crane, alone of all of them, told me the truth to my face. She said the mud came once, and the mud is still down there, and the only thing that had ever held the mud in its place, the only thing keeping the drowned world from rising back up through the socket of that buried star and taking the ceiling for itself, was the family on the spit, kept fed, kept patient, kept, above all, unwilling to come upstairs and get its own supper. Emmett Shaw, the old doctor, gave me the rest of it across 3 more evenings and a great deal more whisky, and he gave it to me in pieces, out of order, the way a man surrenders a thing he has guarded so long that letting go of it feels like dying a little at a time. He had not been a real physician. There had never been a real physician in the Bend. He had learned what he knew from the man before him, who had learned it from the man before him, and part of what he had learned, the largest part, the part that had nothing to do with fevers or broken bones, was how to be the town's witness at the 2 doors no one else would stand at. The door a Bend child came into the world through, and the door the arrangement occasionally sent someone out of. He had been down to the Selkirk house more than any living man. When there was a sickness in the bowl that would not break, the elders sent for the thing on the spit, because whatever the Selkirks were, they knew the low ground and its illnesses the way a landlord knows the rot in his own walls, and more than once a Selkirk hand laid on a dying child had cooled a fever that Emmett Shaw could not cool himself. He hated telling me this. Worse, he hated that it was true. He said that the family had never once refused to help a sick child of the Bend, not in all his years, and that this was the worst part of the whole business, because it made the arrangement feel almost like love, and a cage that feels like love is the hardest cage in the world to break. The bodies were the thing he could least bear to speak of. When a Selkirk went into the ground, and it did happen, rarely across the long years, they were not buried in the churchyard on the high ground. They were carried down into the bowl to the fallow field with the buried point of the star, and they were laid into the socket, and Emmett Shaw had helped carry them, and he swore to me on the last night that a Selkirk in death did not go the way a man goes. He had opened a grave once years after on an errand I could not make him fully describe, and the body had not decayed. It had not been preserved by any art. It had simply lain there in the black ground unchanged, cool and even and patient, the way the children's hands were cool waiting, he said, and he would not tell me for what, only that when he had filled the grave back in, he had done it faster than he had ever done anything in his life, and had not gone down into the bowl after dark again for the rest of his years. He told me about the counts, too, from the other side. It was the doctor's job in the old days to walk the census man down to the spit, because no county census taker would go alone, and none of them ever came back a second decade. Emmett had walked 3 of them down in his time. He described the moment every one of them broke. It was always the same. The census man would knock, and the door would open, and Corliss Selkirk would give his name and his household and his ages in that low, slow voice, and the census man would write it all down in his official book with his official pencil, and then he would look up from the page at the face in the doorway, and something behind the census man's eyes would quietly go out, like a lamp carried into a wind. They wrote the name down. They always wrote the name down. And then they left the bowl, and they took a job in another county, and they never spoke of Bleak Ash Bend again, exactly like the state engineer with his sounding line. Exactly like every outsider the town had ever been forced to let get close enough to see. That, Emmett Shaw told me, was why he had begged the county to strike the town from the record in the 20s, and why the county, God help them, had agreed. Not to erase the Selkirks. You cannot erase the Selkirks. To erase the road that led to them, a town that does not appear on the map is a town no census man is ever sent to. And a census man who is never sent is a mind that never goes out like a lamp in the wind. The whole apparatus of forgetting, the missing maps, the burned counts, the flood story, the arrangement itself, it was never built to keep the town safe from the family. It was built to keep the world safe from ever finding the door. I asked Emmett Shaw more than once what the inside of the Selkirk house was like, and each time he answered me, he answered a slightly different question than the one I had put to him. The way a man does when the true answer sits somewhere he does not want to walk. On the last night he stopped dodging. He set his glass down, and he told me that the house had no inside, not in the sense that a house has an inside. There was a front room, low and dark and cold, with a table and 2 chairs and a cold hearth that he had never once seen lit, and beyond the front room there was a door, and beyond the door there were stairs, and the stairs went down. That was the whole of the house, 1 cold room and a stair. He had stood at the top of that stair exactly twice in his long life, both times to carry a sick Ben child down to be cooled by a Selkirk hand, and both times he had gone no further than the 3rd step, and both times he had felt the air change against his face at that 3rd step, going from the ordinary damp cold of a riverside cellar to something else, something wide, a cold that had distance in it, the cold of a very large space opening somewhere far below in the dark. He told me the stairs were made of the grey stone, not lined with it, made of it, cut from it, part of it, the same close-grained masonry as the foundation and the churchyard wall and the broken point of the star in the fallow field, and the stairs did not turn the way cellar stairs turn. They went straight down, and they were wide, wider than the house above them by far, wide enough that the little room and its 2 chairs sat on top of the stairhead, like a hut built over the mouth of a mine, and the width of them was the thing that undid him, because a stair that wide was not built to reach a cellar. A stair that wide was built to bring a great many people up, or to let a great many people down, in a town that once had a great many people in it, in the sunlight before the mud. He had felt, standing on the 3rd step with a fevered child in his arms and the wide cold rising up the shaft against his face, that he was standing at the top of a street. Not a stair. A street tilted on its end and driven down into the earth, the main street of the drowned town going down and down into the dark under the bowl, and somewhere at the bottom of it, patient and unhurried, and never once in a hurry across all the long years, the rest of them, keeping house. He never went below the third step. No man of the bend ever had, as far as he knew, and lived to sit in a kitchen and speak of it. The arrangement did not require it. The arrangement required only that the basket be left at the top on the flat grey stone at the head of the spit, and that the door of the little room be left unbarred, so that in the night, in the deep of it, a cool and even hand could come up the wide stair to the cold front room and carry the basket down. No one had to see it happen. That was the mercy the town had bargained for, and the mercy the family had granted. The upper world left the food. The lower world came up in the dark and took it. And the third step, where the ordinary cold became the wide cold, was the border between the two, a line no basket-bearer crossed and no Selkirk crossed in daylight, drawn in grey stone across the top of a buried street, holding two worlds a single stair apart. I want to be careful here, because this is the part where a story like this usually reaches for a monster, and the Selkirks were not a monster, and calling them one would be the last and largest lie the Bend ever told. They were not demons, they were not the restless dead. And they were, as far as I have been able to reason it out from everything I saw and everything I was told, simply older residents. They were the people of the world that lies under the mud. Their kind had lived in the tall grey town in the sunlight, in the drawing the schoolboy titled home. And when the mud came and buried that world in an afternoon, most of their kind went down under it and did not come up, and a few, a very few, on the highest points of the buried stars, kept their heads above the rising sediment, and lived on into the thin new world that grew over the roofs of the old one. They did not change. Their world had ended, and they had not ended with it. And so they went on, cool and patient and unaging, in the low houses that our histories would later call the oldest in the county, because to the new people who built on the ceiling of the drowned world, the survivors of the deep were indistinguishable from the deep foundations they lived upon. Both were simply the oldest things around. Both were simply here first. Consider what that means for the record you have been handed your whole life. The star works under the cities, the ones the textbooks call forts, appear in their thousands across the northern world, always half sunk, always older than the settlement above them. And the standard history asks you to believe that our recent ordinary ancestors built these enormous geometric works of superb masonry, used them briefly for a purpose no one can quite explain, and then buried them under yards of earth and forgot them entirely within a generation or two. That is the story we are given. It has never held together, and everyone who has ever pushed on it feels the give. But stand in Bleak Ash Bend on the one point of the star that never went under, and look at the family that has been counted under one name for 100 years and fed by the men of the village for 90, and a different story assembles itself, and it holds together with a horrible completeness. The star works are old because they are from before. They are buried because the mud buried them. And in the rarest places, on the highest points, a few of the people from before are buried with them but not dead. And the towns that grew up on top made their quiet arrangements with the ones who remained, and then spent every year since making sure the rest of us would never be sent down the road to knock on the door. How many Bleak Ash Bends are there? That is the question I could not stop asking myself on the long drive home. And it is the question I am handing to you now, because I do not have the answer, and I am not sure I want it. How many towns are missing from how many maps? Consider how many parish registers hold a burdened span of years sewn carefully back into the binding. How many second larders stand fuller than they should in how many farmhouses, on how much low ground, all over the buried world, each one keeping its own patient resident fed, each one teaching its children that the feeding is simply weather. We are told the old world ended. And we are told the mud is just geology, the star forts are just forts, the missing towns are just clerical error, the long-lived families of the deep country are just folklore and bad arithmetic. We are told to look at the ceiling and never wonder about the floor. And in 100 sunken bowls across the northern earth, the men carry the baskets down at dusk and leave them on the flat grey stone and walk home without looking back, and are inside before dark and say nothing, so that you and I can go on believing the floor is solid ground. I did not want to leave the Bend with nothing but the testimony of frightened old men, so before I left I did what a person of my time and training does. I gathered evidence. I want to tell you what happened to that evidence, because it is its own small chapter of the same fear, and because it taught me something about why the record of the world above looks the way it looks. I took a chip of the grey stone. I did it at the churchyard wall, not at the house, because I was not fool enough to go chipping at the Selkirk foundation. And I wrapped the chip in cloth and carried it out of the bowl and mailed it to a geologist at a state university, a man I had corresponded with before on other matters, with a note asking only that he tell me what it was and how old. His reply, when it came weeks later, was 2 paragraphs of unease dressed up as science. The stone, he wrote, was a fine-grained metamorphic rock consistent with formations that did not occur anywhere within 400 miles of the county I had mailed it from. The working of it, the cut faces, showed tool marks he could not place, neither the marks of modern quarrying nor the marks of any pre-modern method he was familiar with, and the surface bore a polish that he described, in a sentence he had clearly rewritten several times, as more consistent with great age and great pressure than with any human finishing he could name. He asked me where I had gotten it. He asked twice. I never answered him, and he wrote to me once more, months later, a short note asking me to disregard his analysis, saying he had reconsidered and believed the sample had been contaminated, and requesting that I not cite his name in connection with it. I understood the shape of that note. I had seen the shape of it before, in a state engineer packing his instruments, in a census man taking a job in another county. The stone had put out his lamp a little from 400 miles away through the mail. The photographs were worse and stranger. I had taken a full roll of the Selkirk house from the towpath, careful shots, the foundation, the mismatched walls, the deep small windows, and when the film came back the house was in every frame, and the house was also not right in every frame. The prints were not blurred. Everything around the house was sharp, the reeds, the black water, the towpath under my own feet. Only the house sat wrong in the emotion, its lines not quite meeting, its proportions sliding when you moved your eye across the print the way the man in the doorway had slid when I tried to hold his face, so that a wall that should have been 20 feet read as 40 in the corner of the eye and snapped back to 20 when you looked at it straight. I have shown those prints to 3 people. 2 handed them back quickly and changed the subject. The third, a photographer of 30 years, studied them for a long time and told me the negatives showed no sign of double exposure or lens fault or development error that he could find, and that as far as his craft could tell him the camera had recorded exactly what was in front of it, and then he handed the prints back too, and he did not want to talk about them any more either. So, this is the evidence I carried up out of the bowl, a stone that comes from nowhere nearby and was cut by no method anyone can name, analysed by a man who then begged me to forget he had analysed it, a house that a camera cannot hold still, and the word of old men who fed a family for 90 years and asked nothing in return but silence. It is not proof of the kind a court would take, I know that, but I have come to believe that the reason the world above has no proof of the world below is not that the proof does not exist. It is that the proof behaves exactly like everything else that gets close to the door. The proof goes quiet. It asks to be forgotten. It puts out the lamp of the man who holds it up gently from a distance through the mail and leaves him standing in a room that is darker than it was, holding a stone he can no longer bring himself to explain. There is a question that sits underneath all of this, and it is not the question of what the Selkirks were. It is the harder one. How does a secret survive 90 years inside a living town? Secrets do not keep themselves. People talk, sons rebel against fathers, wives grow bitter and spill things in kitchens, strangers marry in. Young men leave for the cities and telephone home drunk on a bad night, and say the thing that was never to be said. By every ordinary law of how human beings actually behave, the arrangement of Bleak Ash Bend should have broken open 100 times over, and it did not, and the reason it did not is the last and quietest horror of the whole account, and Hollis Verrick was the one who finally made me see it. The secret survived because the town was never really keeping it from the outside world at all. The town was keeping it from itself. The genius of the arrangement, if a thing so old can be said to have genius, was that no single person in the bend ever held the whole of it. The man who carried the basket did not know why. The storekeeper who ordered the flour under upkeep did not know for whom. The clerk who kept the burned counts knew about the counts, but not about the graves. The doctor knew about the graves, but had never seen the drawing the schoolboy made. Each person held one tile of the mosaic, and each person had been taught, gently, from childhood, that to lay your tile down next to your neighbour's and look at the picture forming was the one unforgivable thing, the thing that let the mud in. I was the first person in 90 years to gather the tiles, and I could only do it because I was a stranger, because I owed no man in the bowl the courtesy of not asking, and because I was leaving, and could carry the finished picture out past the tree line where no one born in the bend was ever quite able to carry it. Hollis understood what he had done by opening the cabinet for me. On my last night in the bend, he came to the room I had taken above the store, and he did not sit down, and he told me the part of the oath he had not told me before. The clerks of Bleak Ash Bend did not only swear to keep the record hidden, they swore to keep it findable. That was the piece that undid me. Somewhere in the deep past, one of the Verricks had understood that a secret kept perfectly is as a secret that dies with the last mouth that holds it, and that when the arrangement finally failed, as one day it must, whoever came after would need to be able to learn what the Bend had known, quickly, before they made the mistake of stopping the baskets out of ignorance. So the burned counts were preserved instead of destroyed, and so the drawing was kept in a drawer for 30 years. So the doctor trained his witness, and the witness trained his. The whole machinery of forgetting had a second machinery hidden inside it, a machinery of remembering. Wound tight and set aside against the day, the town could no longer feed the thing on the spit and needed a stranger to understand why they must find some way to feed it still. That day, Hollis told me, was close. The Bend was dying the ordinary way now, the way all these small deep towns are dying. The young were gone and not coming back. The second larders in the empty farmhouses stood cold. The cycle that once rotated across 40 households now fell on the same 6 aging men, over and over. And one hard winter, one influenza season, one string of funerals would break it the way it had almost broken in 1919. And this time there would be no town left to fill the empty houses by spring. This time the baskets would simply stop. Hollis had opened the cabinet for me, he said, because he had done the arithmetic of his own town's death. And he had understood that he might be the last clerk, and that if the arrangement was going to outlive Bleak Ash Bend, it would have to do it in the mouth of someone from outside. He had chosen me, but he had not asked me. He had simply handed me the picture, tile by tile, and now he stood in my rented room and told me the thing he had brought me all this way to hear. He told me I was not the first stranger the Verricks had chosen. There had been one other 2 clerks back, in his grandfather's time, a man much like me who had come asking about old stone, and had stayed too long and learned too much, and had been handed the picture the same careful way. That man had not believed it. He had done what a reasonable man does. He had taken his notes and gone home to the city and written it all down as a curiosity, a piece of rural strangeness, a superstition dressed up as history, and he had made plans to publish it, to hold the whole absurd arrangement of Bleak Ash Bend up to the light, and let the modern world laugh at it. Hollis's grandfather had begged him not to, had written him letters, had gone to the city himself once, an old country clerk on a train, to sit in the man's parlour and plead with him to understand that the arrangement was not superstition, that the mud was real, that the thing on the spit was real, and that publishing the door's location to a world of curious readers was not brave, it was the single most dangerous act a person could commit, because it invited the world to come and knock. The man published anyway. And here Hollis stopped and looked at the floor of my rented room and told me the rest in a voice gone very flat. The article never appeared. The man was found at his desk with the pages in front of him, and the county doctor in the city wrote that his heart had simply stopped. A healthy man of 50, no cause, no warning, the lamp carried into the wind and quietly gone out. His notes were returned to his widow. His widow, frightened by something she could not name, sent them back to Bleak Ash Bend, to the only address her husband had corresponded with, to the clerk who had begged him to stay silent, and they went into the cabinet. And they were preserved, not destroyed, because in the Bend you never destroy a name completely. I had read parts of them without knowing what they were. They were in the burned book, sewn in among the counts, in a different hand, the hand of a man who had learned the whole picture and had not lived to publish it. I understood then why Hollis had watched me with such sorrow the whole time I was in his town. He had not been deciding whether to trust me. Instead, he had been watching a man walk down a road he had watched another man walk down before, and knowing where the road ended, and choosing, out of some mercies I still cannot fully weigh, to warn me before I reached the end of it. He told me I could do one of 2 things with what I had gathered. I could carry it out of the bowl and keep it, the way the doctors and the clerks and the storekeepers had kept it, one tile among many, told to no one, an arrangement I now belonged to, whether I had agreed to or not. Or I could do what the man 2 clerks back had done. I could lay all the tiles down in the open, in front of the whole curious world, and point at the picture, and name the town, and draw the map to the door. And if I did that, Hollis said, he did not think my heart would fare any better than that other man's had. Not because the Selkirks would come for me. The Selkirks never left the spit, but because the door does not like to be pointed at, and the world that lies under the mud has ways of putting out a lamp that has drawn too much attention to the floor. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the narrow bed above the store and listened to the bowl, and the bowl is not silent after dark the way ordinary country is silent. There is a sound down there that I have never been able to name. A low, even sound with no rhythm to it, felt more than heard. The sound you would imagine a very great weight makes when it settles a fraction of an inch and then holds. It came up through the floorboards and through the black spit of ground and through the grey stone, under everything, and I understood that I was hearing the floor of the world being kept in place, and that somewhere down at the water a family that was here before the mud was sitting patient in the dark, fed, unhurried, waiting for the last basket the way you or I might wait, without alarm, for a season we have watched arrive 100 times before. In the grey light before dawn I did a thing I had told myself I would not do. I walked back down the towpath to the spit, alone, in the worst light there is, the light that is neither night nor morning. I do not fully know why. Part of it was that I am the kind of man who finishes a survey. Part of it was that I wanted to leave something on the flat grey stone myself once, so that whatever else I did with this account, I would have carried a basket, would have belonged to the arrangement in fact, and not only in knowledge. I had taken bread and salt and a little tallow from the store's own shelf, and I filled a cloth, and I carried it down through the mist, and my heart was going the way it had gone the first day, and the low even sound was louder the closer I came to the water. The door was open. It had not been open the first time until Corliss filled it, but this time it stood open into the dark before I reached the stone, and I understood that I was expected. And I set the cloth down on the grey stone with hands I could barely keep steady. I did not look into the doorway. I had promised myself that much. Bring the basket. Leave it on the stone. Do not look back. Be home before dark. Every rule the town had was designed to keep a man from doing the one thing I now had to fight my whole body not to do, which was to look through that open door and down the stairs the schoolboy had drawn, into the tall lit town under the mud, at the world from before, whole and dry and waiting for the ceiling to come off. I kept my eyes on the stone. I turned. I walked back up the towpath in the rising mist, and I did not look behind me, and behind me, low and slow, in a voice I felt in the grey stone under my feet more than I heard in the air, Corliss Selkirk said the last thing anyone in Bleak Ash Bend ever said to me. He thanked me. He thanked me, and he told me that the world above was so much heavier than it needed to be, and that one day when the men stopped coming with their baskets, the family would simply come up and set it down. I left the bend that morning, and I have not gone back. I have wanted to, more than once, in the way you want to press on a bad tooth, and every time I have started the drive I have turned around before the road drops down into the low country, because I know now what the state engineer knew when he packed his instruments, which is that the bowl lets you go once and does not always offer the courtesy twice. What I have done instead, over the 2 years since, is try to find the edges of the thing from the safety of the world above, and everything I have found from up here has only confirmed what I was told down there. The county records are exactly as Hollis described them. Bleak Ash Bend and does not appear in the state census before the 1920s. It appears afterward thinly, a shrinking population of a few dozen souls, and then, in the most recent count, it does not appear at all again. This time not because anyone struck it out, but because there was almost no one left in it to count. I wrote to the Regional Historical Society under a false name and asked, as an idle genealogist might, whether they held anything on a family called Selkirk in that district. The reply came from a volunteer, and it was 3 sentences long, and the middle sentence has stayed with me. She wrote that the society did not maintain files on that district, and she wrote that she would recommend I not pursue the name. She wrote that this was the advice she had been given when she took the position, and that she had always found it wise to follow advice she did not understand. I found the earlier man too. The one 2 clerks back, the one whose notes went into the burned book. He was real. I traced him through a city directory and an old obituary, a writer of some small reputation in his day, and the obituary gave the date of his death and the cause, which was recorded as sudden heart failure, a healthy man of 50, and it named the article he had been working on at the time of his death, an article on rural survivals and folk belief in the deep river country, an article that was never published and of which no manuscript, the obituary noted, was ever found among his papers. His papers were incomplete, the notice said. It was assumed he had destroyed the unfinished work himself. I know where the work is. It is sewn into a burned ledger in a locked cabinet in a dying town that is not on any map, kept findable against the day the baskets stop, and I am one of the only people alive above the mud who has held it in my hands and understood what it was. The bend is nearly empty now, Hollis wrote to me once, a single letter, a year after I left, in the careful clerk's hand, of 4 generations. He told me the count of living men in the bowl had fallen to 5. He told me the cycle now fell to each of them once every 5 days, and that they were old, all of them, and that the winters were long. There was nothing in it he asked me for. He did not tell me what to do. He only wrote at the end that he wanted one person somewhere in the world above to know the arrangement was still holding on the 5th of March in the year he wrote, and that when it stopped holding I would likely not hear about it in any way the newspapers of the upper world would recognize, and that I should not, whatever I saw or read, come down to see for myself. I have spent the 2 years since looking for other bends, and I want to tell you plainly what that search has and has not turned up, because it would be easy for me to sit here and claim I have found 100 of them and frighten you with a number. I have not found 100 of them. What I have found is a pattern of absences, and once you learn to see the shape of the absence you cannot unsee it, and it is worse than a number. Start with the maps, the way I did. All across the deep river country of this continent there are towns that a state census records for a while and then quietly stops recording. Towns that persist in a parish register or a church roll or a tax roll for decades after the state has ceased to acknowledge them. Low-lying places, bowl places, places where the water doubles back. Historians call these the vanished settlements, and the standard explanation is depopulation, the young leaving for the cities, the old dying off, the ordinary slow death of rural places. And that is true of most of them. But not all of them died. Some of them simply stopped being counted, while people still lived in them. And if you overlay the vanished settlements onto the geological maps of the great sediment layer, onto the places where the mud lies thickest and the old buried works lie deepest, the 2 maps agree far more often than depopulation alone should allow. The towns that fell off the record are not scattered at random. They cluster on the sunken ground. And they cluster on the starworks. They cluster, in other words, exactly where you would expect to find a door. I have written to clerks and to volunteers and to genealogists in a dozen of those places, always under other names, always asking idle questions, and the replies sort themselves into 2 kinds. Most are ordinary. Most tell me about grandmothers and farm sales and the year the church burned, the true and mundane history of a place that died the way places die. But a few are not ordinary. A few reply with the 3-sentence letter, the recommendation not to pursue a certain name, the advice given and followed without being understood. A few go quiet in exactly the way Hollis went quiet, the careful hesitation of a person deciding how much they are allowed to remember. And in one, only one, from a settlement 4 states away that has not appeared on a census since before the war, a woman wrote back a single line before she stopped answering me altogether. She wrote that in her town, too. The men still carried the baskets down to the water, and that she was glad someone had finally asked, and that I must never ever come. I do not know how many there are. I have made my peace with not knowing, which is a lie, because a man does not make peace with a thing that keeps him awake. Every road I drove after leaving the bowl felt as if it might, at some low crossing of the darker water, quietly stop being counted the way that town had been. But I have stopped pretending the number is small, and I have stopped pretending this is folklore, and I have stopped pretending, most of all, that the history we are handed is a description of the world rather than a wall built across the front of it. The star works are not forts. The mud is not ordinary geology. The vanished towns did not all simply empty out. Under the floor of the ordinary world there is another world, and it is not dead, only buried, and in the deep places the 2 worlds touch. and where they touch there is always a family that came up out of the deep, and a town above that keeps it fed, and a long patient silence stretched over the whole arrangement, like new grass over an old grave. Let me lay the wider pattern out plainly, the way I finally laid it out for myself on the wall of my study, because once you see the 3 maps stacked on top of one another, you will not be able to pretend they are unrelated, and I would rather you see it now from the safety of wherever you are sitting than stumble onto it alone some night, the way I did. The first map is the map of the buried works, all across the northern half of the world, under old cities and empty fields alike. The ground holds the outlines of enormous geometric structures, walls and ramparts laid out in radiant, many-pointed stars, built of superb stone with a precision our recent ancestors are not otherwise credited with, and every one of them sits partly sunk in the earth as though the earth rose up around it. The histories call them fortifications. They are too numerous to be fortifications, too uniform across cultures that supposedly never spoke, and far too many of them sit under yards of undisturbed sediment that no army ever shovelled into place. The second map is the map of that sediment itself, the great even layer of mud and silt that lies over the older world nearly everywhere you dig, deep enough to find it, a layer that arrives too suddenly and lies too flat to be the slow work of ordinary centuries, a layer that looks, when you stand in an excavation and put your hand against it, like the mark of a single drowning afternoon. And the third map is the one I made myself, the map of the towns that fell off the record, the low-lying settlements the census kept for a while and then stopped keeping, the bold places, the places in a bend of dark water, where the old people go quiet when you ask the wrong name. Stack those 3 maps, and they are not 3 maps, they are 1 map, printed 3 times. The buried stars, the drowning mud, and the erased towns lie on the same ground, cluster in the same low places, gather most thickly exactly where the old world sank deepest, and the new world grew thinnest over the top of it. And on that shared ground, in the rarest and lowest sockets, where a single high point of a buried star kept its head above the sediment, you find the last thing, the thing no map wants to show and no history will name. You find a family that does not age, counted under one name across a century of burned counts, fed by the men of the town above for as long as the town has stood. You find a door, and you find an arrangement. You find a covered basket left on a flat grey stone in the last of the light, and a stair of grey stone going straight down into a cold that has distance in it, and a whole tall town in the sunlight waiting at the bottom for the ceiling to come off. I am not asking you to believe that every sunken town hides a Selkirk. Most of them are only sunken towns, drowned the ordinary way, empty the ordinary way, sad the ordinary way. But some of them are not, and the record was built, deliberately, patiently, over generations, to make sure you could never tell the difference from the outside, to strike the roads from the maps and burn the counts from the ledgers, and dress the whole drowned world up as forts and geology and clerical error, so that you would look at the bright ceiling of the ordinary world, your whole life, and never once, not for a single uneasy evening, wander about the floor. The men of Bleak Ash Bend spent 90 years keeping that record intact for you, and I have spent this last hour taking one thread of it out of the wall and holding it up to the light and asking you to look. I keep coming back in the dark hours to the men, not to the Selkirks. The Selkirks are what they are, and a thing from before the mud owes the upper world no explanation for wanting to be fed. I come back to the men of Bleak Ash Bend, the ordinary fathers and sons who carried the baskets down at dusk for 90 years, because the title I have given this account calls them the men every one of whom helped cover it up, and I want to be sure you understand that the covering up was not cowardice. It would be so much easier if it were cowardice. I could stand here and tell you the men of the Bend were weak, that they fed the thing in the water because they were too frightened to do the brave thing, and you could go to bed comforted, certain that you, being braver, would have done otherwise. But I sat in their kitchens, and I looked into their faces, and I do not believe it was cowardice, and I will not lie to you to help you sleep. The men of the Bend covered it up because they had done the arithmetic that Ardith Crane laid out for me at her kitchen table. And the arithmetic is sound. What lies under the mud is not one family. One family is what stays on the spit and takes the basket. But the drawing the schoolboy made showed a whole tall town down there in the sunlight, a whole world of people from before, and the family on the spit is only the doorkeeper, the one who came up, the one whose patience holds the rest of them below. Feed the doorkeeper and the door stays a door, a thing that opens one way, downward, for a covered basket left at dusk. Stop feeding the doorkeeper and the door becomes a mouth, and the town from before comes up the stairs to set down the weight of the upper world it has been holding out of what may be the closest thing such a people have to courtesy. The men of Bleak Ash Bend were not protecting themselves. 5 old men in a dying bowl have very little self left to protect. They were protecting you. They were protecting the county and the state and the map and the whole thin bright ceiling of the ordinary world, one basket at a time, for 90 years. And they did it in total silence, without thanks, without a single soul above the mud ever knowing their names or what those names had bought. That is the cover-up, not a crime hidden, a duty carried. Every man in that village helped conceal the Selkirks from the world, not because the Selkirks were ashamed to be hidden, but because the men understood, the way you understand a thing in your bones long before you can say it, that a secret is sometimes the only load-bearing wall a world has. Pull it down to feel brave, to feel honest, to feel modern, and you do not let the light in, you let the mud out. The state engineer felt it and packed his instruments. The census men felt it and went out like lamps. The one writer who did not feel it, who pulled on the wall to show the world how quaint the wall was, died at his desk with the pages in front of him, and the wall still standing, because the wall does not need the writer's belief in order to bear its load, and it does not forgive being leaned on by a man who thinks it is decoration. So when Hollis Verrick handed me the picture tile by tile, he was not confessing a sin, he was transferring a duty from a dying town to a stranger who could carry it up out of the bowl, and I have carried it, and I am carrying it now, into your ears, which means that as of this moment, whether you asked for it or not, you are carrying a corner of it too. There was a bridge in Bleak Ash Bend that I have not yet told you about, and I have saved it because it is the single detail that made the whole arrangement feel most human to me, and most sad. It was an old timber bridge over the narrow neck of the water, where the river came closest to doubling onto itself, and it was the shortest way from the high ground to the spit, and no man in 3 generations would set foot on it after the light was gone. They would walk the long way instead, the whole curve of the towpath, an extra half-hour in the cold, rather than cross the bridge in the dark. When I asked why, I got the pauses, the looking at the hands, but one of the 5 old men, the youngest of them still short of 70, finally told me. And what he told me was not a story of a monster on the bridge. It was smaller than that, and it was worse. He said his father had told him that the bridge was where you could hear them, not the family on the spit, the others, the whole town under the mud. He said that if you stood on the timber bridge at night, over the neck where the water ran deepest and the buried stone came closest to the surface, you could hear under the water, under the sediment, very far down and very faint, the sound of an ordinary evening in an ordinary town, doors, voices, the scrape of a chair, a whole living town going about the last hour before its own bedtime, carried up through the black water on a night when the wind was right, from a place that the mud buried in an afternoon, and that has apparently not, in all the centuries since, understood that it is over. The men would not cross the bridge after dark because they could not bear to hear it, not fear, grief. They were listening to their own oldest neighbours keeping house in a world that ended before the county was born, and every one of them knew that the only thing standing between that sound and the sound of those same doors opening onto the upper air was a covered basket left on a flat grey stone in the last of the daylight by their own hands forever. I stood on that bridge once, in daylight, and I heard nothing but water. I was glad. I have been glad ever since. There are sounds a person can carry up out of a place, and sounds that keep the person, and I think that sound would have kept me, and I think, in a way I cannot prove, that this is the mercy in why the men only ever went at dusk and were always home before dark. I have thought a great deal about why Hollis chose me, and I have come to believe it was not for anything special in me at all. It was for the thing you and I are doing right now. The old machinery of remembering that the Verricks kept wound tight inside the machinery of forgetting was built for a world of clerks and cabinets and locked rooms, a world where a duty could be handed from one careful mouth to one careful ear and no further. That world is ending. The towns are dying. The cabinets are being emptied by relatives who do not know what they hold and sold to strangers who will never understand what they have bought. A secret that lives in one locked room dies when the room is opened by the wrong hand. And so, I think, some part of Hollis understood that the only cabinet large enough to hold the arrangement now, the only ledger findable enough to survive the death of the last clerk, is exactly the kind of account you are hearing, carried not in a locked book but in 10,000 ears at once, kept alive not by secrecy but by its opposite. This is the paradox I have had to make my peace with. The writer 2 clerks back was killed for pointing at the door, and I have just spent an hour pointing at it, and I am, as far as I can tell, still alive. The difference, I believe, is the difference between a map and a warning. That man drew a map. He named the town so the curious could find it, described the road so the bold could drive it, held the arrangement up as a curiosity to be examined and, if the reader liked, visited. He pointed at the door and said, "Come and look." I am pointing at the door and saying the one thing the men of Bleak Ash Bend spent 90 years unable to say, and dying to have said. I am saying, do not come. I am saying, when you find your own bend, and if the pattern is what I think it is, a great many of you will, in a low town on sunken ground, where the water doubles back and the old people go quiet when you ask the wrong name. Do not pull on the wall. Do not stop the baskets to prove you are braver than the fathers who carried them. Do not open the door to see if the story is true. The story is true. The wall is load-bearing. And the courtesy of the world from before, the setting down of a weight it has held out of patience for longer than our histories are old, is not a courtesy any of us above the mud will survive. So I will end where I began, with the word I asked you to type at the start, the word bend, and with the reason it matters more than it looked like it should. Every one of you who typed it who has lived in a place that keeps a secret. The whole town agrees never to name. I need you to consider tonight that not every such secret is a shame. Some of them are baskets. Many of the silences you grew up inside, the subjects the old people would not discuss, the family down by the water everyone fed and no one spoke of, the arrangement you were folded into as a child before you were old enough to refuse. Some of those were not the town hiding its wickedness. Some of them were the town holding up the floor. And if you ever find yourself grown and modern and certain, standing over one of those old silences with your hand on the wall, ready to pull it down and let the light in, I hope you will remember Bleak Ash Bend and the 5 old men carrying baskets down to Blackwater in the last of the light, and the low even sound of a very great weight settling a fraction of an inch and then holding. They are still down there on the 5th of March of the year Hollis wrote to me. The arrangement still holding. 5 old men, 1 patient family on the spit, a whole tall town in the sunlight under the mud, waiting for the ceiling to come off. I do not know how many baskets are left. I do not know which winter will be the one that breaks the cycle for good, and I have made my peace with not going down to see, which is the last lie I will tell you, because no one makes peace with that. I only wound the machinery 1 turn tighter tonight and handed it to you, and now the arrangement lives in you as well, findable, remembered, carried up out of the bowl into the bright, forgetful world above. Keep it, do not test it, and the next time you pass a low town that the map forgot in a bend of dark water, and something in you goes quiet without knowing why, do the wise thing the volunteer did. Follow the advice you do not understand. Leave the basket on the stone, and be home before dark.